Bueno, bienvenidos a todos, bienvenidos sean todos a este magno evento. Con su presencia le damos la bienvenida a nuestros invitados especiales, que no solo nos acompañan con su grata presencia, sino que nos honran con el interés y la determinación para el logro de la excelencia en esta prestigiada universidad. Nos acompañan las autoridades universitarias, invitados especiales y Universidad Católica de Honduras. Welcome everyone to this great event. We salute to the distinguished members who honor us not only with their presence, but also with the interest and determination to achieve the excellence in this prestigious university. En este momento damos la palabra a la vicerrectora académica, máster, licenciada Marta Mélida Morales, quien dará palabras alusivas al evento. At this moment, we give the space to the academic Vice Chancellor, Marta Mélida Morales.
Buenas tardes. Para no robarnos tanto tiempo de la conferencia, quiero en primer lugar disculpar al señor rector de la universidad, el licenciado Francisco Rosa. Él se encuentra pues en otro evento vinculado con temas de acreditación internacional con HCERES exactamente. Para la Universidad José Cecilio del Valle, una universidad con 41 años de experiencia en el campo de educación superior, es un honor poder tener en nuestras aulas, porque esta igual es nuestra aula magna, un conferencista como el señor Patrick Schumacher. Damos la cordial bienvenida a lo que es la empresa New Way que nos está acompañando en este proceso, en especial a nuestros respetables docentes que nos acompañan, a nuestros estimados estudiantes, a nuestros queridos egresados, que es una alegría pues tenerlos por acá, y definitivamente pues a los estudiantes de universidades hermanas que trabajan en el campo de la arquitectura y el diseño y que tuvieron a bien acompañar esta conferencia. Señor Patrick Schumacher, muchas gracias por elegir la Universidad José Cecilio del Valle para desarrollar esta conferencia, de la cual como expectativa definitivamente genera un cambio generacional en docentes, en estudiantes, en egresados de la arquitectura y el diseño, todos en común profesionales de la arquitectura, que a partir de este momento se hace un clic definitivamente en nuestras cabezas, en nuestras mentes, para innovar más allá del tema de lo que es la parte tecnológica, el diseño del futuro, en miras de lo que es la parte de la creatividad. Son magnos, son maravillosos los arquitectos, y en este momento pues como universidad nos sentimos muy satisfechos de tener una comunidad de profesionales de este campo. Sabemos que en nuestras aulas los docentes harán réplica de lo aprendido y vamos a trabajar en duro para lo que en estos minutos se comparta con nosotros, pues sea replicado en cada uno de los espacios que nos movemos. Agradecer en especial a las personas que han hecho el contacto con nuestra universidad, a la señora Liz. Estamos maravillados, no podemos negarlo, estamos contentos, y el firme compromiso que nuestra casa de estudios queda con las puertas abiertas para atenderles. Disfruten, porque esta conferencia es para disfrutar, porque es conocimiento. Buenas tardes.
And now, Patrick Schumacher is a principal of Sahadid Architects and has led the practice in Sahadid passing. Patrick joined SA in 1988 and was a seminal in developing Sahadid Architects into a renewed global architecture and design brand with 4,000 staff in 5 offices around the world. Patrick studied philosophy, mathematics, and architecture in Bonn, Stuttgart, and London, and he received his diploma in architecture in 1990. He has been a partner of ZA since 2003, and he was a co-author of all projects including the Maxi, Italian Museum of the 21st Century Art in Rome, and Evelyn Grace Academy in London. Projects award the 2010 and 2011 Sterling Prize, respectively, by the Royal Institute of British Architecture for Excellence in Architecture. Patrick is an academician of the Berlin Academy of Arts. In 1996, he founded the Design Research Laboratory at the Architectural Association in London, where he continues to teach. In 1999, he also completed his PhD at the Institute of Cultural Science, Klagenfurt University. Patrick lectures around the world and recently held to the John Portman Chair in Architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Patrick has contributed over 100 articles to architectural journals and anthologies. In 2008, he coined the phrase parametricism and has since published a series of manifesto promoting parametricism as the new epochal style for the 21st century. In 2010 and 2012, he published his 2-volume theoretical opus magnum, The Autopoiesis of Architecture. Patrick is widely recognized as one of the most prominent thought leaders within the fields of architecture and urbanism and design. Please, Mr. Patrick, the stage is all yours.
Welcome. Thanks for coming, everybody. Very happy to be here. Thanks to the School of Architecture to host this event and make also a Facebook live stream so the world can participate in our dialogue. It's my first time here in Honduras, and I enjoy the warm welcome very much and hope to come back because I believe there's a lot of work here to do to develop architecture and urbanism in Honduras. So I will talk for a little bit longer than 1 hour, and then I hope we can open the floor to questions and answers. At that time we will also have a translator, but the lecture itself will be just in English. I hope that's okay. So I believe that architecture, and that's the topic of this lecture, is a form of communication. It is actually most of societal processes are communication processes, like this event here. And the architecture is always the first communication, the invitation and the premise of organizing the event and of creating and forming the situation. And that's itself a communicative act. In this case, it's the communicative act of the university to create such a space and to invite all of us into a particular constellation. So that's what architecture does. It facilitates communication, and communication is the most important aspect of coordinating action, collaborating, so that we can generate prosperity. And I believe that our work now has to be adaptive, responsive, and creative. The environment also, and I will show that at the very end, has the capacity to be creative and become intelligent. So we're now also talking about artificial intelligence, not only in machines, but also in buildings. You will see that at the very end. So at Zardin Architects, with Zaha's leadership of the last 30 years, we've developed a new language for architecture, so that we can communicate in a very contemporary way, in ways which are more complex and dynamic and more open-ended than ever before. So all previous communications were more standardized and stereotypical, and now we more and more talking about new forms of interaction in new spaces. So that's why we developed this language of architecture and design, and this goes through all scales and design disciplines. So it starts with urban design on the overall city level, district level, architectural design, interior design, furniture and product design as well, including fashion design. I will talk also about this because that's another way of communicating. Fashion design communicates who we are. And if we decorate and shape our spaces, we also communicate who we are and what kind of event we want to host. So architecture and design is communication. And I'm just going through some of these images so you can see that there is this new language which is very versatile, very rich and varied, but it also has a certain coherency. I would compare it to the endless forms of nature. Now you have many different forms for different purposes, and architecture and design is becoming like that. So we are addressing not only all scales but all program domains. Cultural buildings, also places of living, and a lot of places of work and communication. I'm particularly interested in university buildings as well as buildings and spaces of the knowledge economy. So this is one of our buildings in Rome, and you can see here that this new architecture is adapting itself to the context but also creating something new, a new opportunity. And spaces are very open, they flow into each other in a continuous, ever-changing path. At the same time, you can see that the elements are not only pragmatic elements, they're part of a graphic language. So the art of architecture is actually a graphic communication art. But this graphic is written in 3 dimensions, not on 2 dimensions. So this is the way we look at even towers become very open and porous. They're internally, continuously flowing open. There's ways to connect to other buildings through terraces and internally through atria. These two, this is another university building in Vienna. So there's an openness, a intervisibility and inter-awareness for communicative facilitation. Also, public space are very important. This is a museum and gallery and exhibition center in Korea with a lot of spaces. They're quite different, but also they are connected and similar, and connect up with a lot of public outdoor spaces. So I studied philosophy first and then entered architecture. I'm starting with questioning. Deep and fundamental question. What is architecture all about? That was my question. And often it has been said architecture is shelter to protect you from the weather, the rain, the wind, maybe from wild beasts and other humans perhaps. So that is one function, but I think it's very unspecific. That's not the deep and profound role of architecture, because also in the animal kingdom you have a lot of shelters, and that is only a physical protection. It's an engineering problem, I believe. The architectural problem is something else, and that's what I call the ordering of social processes. That's much more profound. To structure the division of labor and the coordination of many different contributors and many different kinds of activities and events. And the built environment is achieving that ordering of social processes. On the one hand, to pulling things apart and connect them up physically, to arrange them into some kind of pattern, but I think it is also through the architecture's communicative capacity. Because if the arrangements become complex, we need to use them properly, we need to read them and understand them so that we can find each other in a complex process of interaction. And for that, the environment must speak, the environment must be a text we can read, a text of instructions, so that the hundreds and thousands of activities which coordinate millions of people can actually take place, and people are empowered to understand the environment. So I say building is communicating. And I'm arguing that social order always requires spatial order. So it's not only ordering the activities, but also ordering various status groups, rights of access, and to structure that, that the different activities have to be both separate and connected. And the social players, the social roles, have to be defined and stabilized. And that's what we have. The built environment is starting to order society beyond a very small group of primates. And that has always been the case. That's a human universal. There is no human society which is just roaming naked in the wilderness without built environment. So an artificial built environment is a universal condition to build up the social process. So I'm saying becoming human, so from the animal to human, is all to do with differentiating a social order and to start distinguishing social roles, but also groups and subgroups, tribes and clans and families, the various roles of adults and adolescents, chiefs and various specializations. They need to be placed in space, and they need to also become visible through these, let's say, semiology of individual markings. I mean, they are of course a system of differences which emerges, and that's an absolute human universal. There is no society which without this artificial differentiation of and highly conspicuous graphic differentiation of the social roles. And you couldn't have society without that. But also you have to remember that the creation of all these decorations is a very labor-intensive and costly, and bone-breakingly poor communities would never invest in these efforts if they weren't life-enhancing and absolutely vital necessities of societal survival. And that's why they become universals, similar to the physical tools of production. These are tools of social coordination. So we have this kind of spatial morphological differentiation of activities and roles within larger social cooperative order. That's the universe, and you can see the different places, and spaces and roles and activities, so that you can build routines, you can build expectation, you can build a reproduction pattern, and then you can gradually accrue and add to this without losing what is there. So here you have actually a physical substrate of cultural evolution. You need a material, cross-generationally stable physical substrate to accrue gradually social order and cooperative structures. You can make another ring and another ring in a new place, and that's the way you can evolve. And without that, there could be no cultural evolution. So I'm saying architecture is the physical substrate of cultural evolution, material substrate. It's the DNA of cultural evolution. Without that, we wouldn't have cultural evolution. And this is not only the physical place separations and aggregations, but it is also always that semiotic overlay, that graphic language which is attaches to the human body, but it also attaches always to the built environment as well, because the differentiation of the forms only is maybe constrained through pragmatic buildability, and a similar sized space could be used for different purposes, so you need to make a graphic symbolic overlay to distinguish these. And that's the human universal. There's no society which doesn't use ornament and decoration on the built environment. And again, that's not, usually we look at this as some kind of superfluous exuberance for fun and pleasure, but it's not. It's a life necessity. So, it's an absolute universal. This, we don't do that to our, well, to some extent we do it to our face, makeup, and we still do it. And we have now a fashion system where we self-select. It's not so ritualized and socially imposed, but it's still an absolute necessity to self-select and self-sort into an intricate social order. And of course, any coordinated structure, whether it's a body politic or any kind of organization, will have both spatial patterns and rituals and demarcations, ornamentation in the built environment, and particular spatial configurations, as well as this kind of self-ornamenting and marking out who is in charge. And we have some institutions today where this is very strongly conspicuous. So this is a court of law, which is highly important, still very much ritualized, very important also social event where a lot of important work is done for maintaining social order. You can see that everybody has a particular place, there's an arrangement, and there is also still these costumes. And I mean, that's an absolute universal, and you can see here that the amount of effort and investment is high, and still to this day, I know some people who spend a large part of their income on their wardrobe, and it's non-trivial still as a part of the economy, as well as on the buildings. So social order requires spatial order, and you have this investment in your place, and you can see here in these paintings that you have all these different costumes and the different places and the different activity types, which all need to happen simultaneously. And I sometimes make this thought experiment. If you want to know what architecture and design is delivering to society, not shelter, you just should imagine to strip out all this architecture and design and imagine 100,000 naked bodies on a gray surface without demarcations, and assume there's no wild animals and there's no bad weather, so it's not about protection, but you can immediately sense that you would have a loss of information, who you are, what's going on, what's where. So it is the social order and the intricacy of cooperation disappears, and that's the contribution of architecture and design. So actually, sometimes, I mean, this kind of fashion system, again, these costumes are incredibly expensive, and they were also held as precious properties across generations, and they were reinforced by laws, so-called sumptuary laws, where certain forms of consumption were restricted. You couldn't just, this would be a kind of imposter who would just purchase a dress or dress up outside of a kind of social role in which somebody was kind of launched. And you can still kind of feel there's a tension. We feel totally free to self-select into a system of distinction, but we also, there's no sumptuary laws anymore. So we have this kind of subtle self-selection, and we don't do this only, we have only one set in our wardrobe. We have multiple sets, because this has to do with the social context we're entering, the kind of event we're entering. We want to communicate whether we are cool, whether we're sexy, whether we're open to advances or whether we kind of very kind of reserved and formal. So we have to play those instruments, and that's also where we locate the event, we invite into, etc. So this is still incredibly necessary, and we have multiple sets because we are now living in a complex society. We have always multiple roles to play. And the designers, including ourselves, we furnish this material, the new stimulating, the new kind of nuances, hybridizations, and repertoires for you guys to self-select into. So this idea of cultural evolution hooking onto a built environment, then you can reverse read, of course. You look at the built environment, you can actually see and trace the different stages of societal development. And you can also see that certain forms which come out, they're just a kind of evolutionary process. Nobody designed this. You start with a ring of, and then you expand concentrically, and then you differentiate. You try to do this in a context which is irregular, and you end up with kind of broken and slightly irregular forms. But the typology, for instance, of the medieval craft town, market town, is at a certain stage a universally evolved social productive machine, and it reproduced across Europe, thousands of times. And it has a very particular set of organs, like the marketplace, the council house, the church, for reinforcement of, like Durkheim said, God is society, and when you come and sacrifice or pay tribute and hold holy, what you're holding holy in church is actually your dependence on community and society. And that deserves to be held sacred, as it were, to reinforce solidarity and community and overcome that tension between individual and collective interests, which ultimately are you dependent. We're all dependent on community, and that becomes symbolized and reinforced in the collective ritual, which is the sacred. So city is civilization, and in a sense, God is society as well. And so this was an unconscious evolution of social organisms, processes, institutions, and their physical substrate. But in the early Renaissance, about 500-600 years ago, this, through writing, printing and drawing, and through an intellectual reawakening, through the Renaissance, the rediscovery of the ancient wisdom of the ancient Greece, where you had already achieved that in antiquity, that kind of level of reflection, where it's not just an unconscious social process, tradition-bound building and an reproduction of institutions, but there's a reflective appropriation and innovation process, where architecture starts, in fact, and it designs and draws up the ideal city, but it's nothing but the reproduction of the evolved city. But now it's a conscious appropriation and statement, and you can start designing buildings, and you're designing new buildings on paper. So now we're moving into an evolutionary, societal evolution in materiality, inside try and error with real physical investments and battles into kind of a simulation in thought and thinking before you do things. And that's not only the beginning of architecture and urban design with both drawing and theory, because you have to defend innovations through architectural theories. At the same time, the birth of political theory. We actually have a discourse emerging through Machiavelli and others, Hobbes, Montesquieu, where the institutions which had evolved now become consciously critiqued. There are reform agendas, and that is going on together with architecture. And you have, therefore, then the quick reproduction of these ideal cities. This is much faster, and you have also a fast evolution. I want to show that the first, one of the early treatises of political theory is talking about that body politic, that social body. This is the front cover of Hobbes' Leviathan, and actually that we're living in a book and print media era is very important, because this way you can actually have a discourse where one publication is read by many, is critiqued, is followed up by further pamphlets. But what I want to point out is that, so the metaphorical depiction is all these human bodies creating one big organism, but the real social body is actually the city. That's where where all these contributors to the social organization are actually located next to each other and link up to form a social organism. And you can look at that throughout history. The interesting thing is it becomes conscious for the first time in the Renaissance, or for the second time after, let's say, the ancient Greek. And what I'm looking at is therefore the ordering of social processes through architecture. So I'm looking at human bodies configured in spaces, in patterns of such spaces, the different characters with their various roles and territories and costumes distinguished. So that's the way productive social communication takes place and achieves productive order. And that's always the case. So that brings me to this point where it is not these kind of graphic markings, the visual language, which uses where you are. Positionality is not just physically you're positioned, but also symbolically you're positioned. So, but then there's also shape, color, ornament, that graphic language. And so I'm comparing it to the chess game, where you have different players. They have different moves they can make, depending on where they are. But also, there's various ways of articulating this. So this game, of course, only works if I can visually distinguish the queen from the king, from the tower, from the horse, etc. And also I can distinguish the black and the white group. So that's all semiology, that's semiotics, and that is absolutely critical, always already operating. The profound societal contribution of architecture depends on semiology always already. But the architectural discipline, theory of architecture, has not reflected that fact. So it had intuitively played with this without making it a conscious project. Started only in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, but it didn't get very far, and I'm picking up that strand now and go further with it. So here you can see you can design this chessboard in many different ways. All that matters is that there's a system of differences. So we should not be confused about the particulars of one versus another language. They might be absolutely isomorphic. All these chessboards are isomorphic. They have exactly the same meaning. So we shouldn't be confused about the superficiality of difference. If there is the system of differentiation is identical. And that's the way you can look at the various human languages. To some extent, they are translatable into each other, even though they sound very, very differently. And they need to be learned. And that's also with architecture and the visual environment. So there is an arbitrariness to how you articulate the system of differences. But once you start, it's no longer arbitrary. You have to actually build a system of distinctions. And that's what I am doing initially with research projects and students, and also with starting to do with our own work, partly, to try to build up a design like this. Now, the next point of this is very important, that the meanings of these frames and distinctions and places is, of course, the social events that take place, the actors that are invited into, and the protocols and rules of behavior and interaction. And these scripts are attached to each of these different places, like they're attached to different figures on a chessboard or the different moves you can make on a Monopoly game or something like this. So, and it's important that So this project of semiology becomes now operationalized through defining autonomous agents in an agent-based simulation of social interaction where these actors have this language competency and therefore can aggregate in a particular configuration which is intended and can be reproduced. Now, it's not necessarily natural that this kind of pairwise ordering is intended, so there's this element of arbitrariness. You have to know the language to participate. So, and there's a number of analogies we can make. So what I'm looking at always is the various zones and subzones with various thresholds. For instance, on a football pitch, there's a 16-meter space, and once you enter, new rules apply. It's a bit like when you walk from the sidewalk into a private courtyard, new rules apply. So there's a threshold, and it's not necessarily that these different spaces that need to be distinguished through communicated thresholds and not necessarily physically reinforced through walls and boundaries. So you can see the ingredients, and then you have the 5-meter space where there's different rules, where the goalkeeper has more dominance, etc. And you have, again, the different players. You have Team A, Team B, and you have the referee. And the interesting thing is you can have multiple of these games superimposed and inscribed on a space, and that's the way it works in architectural and social spaces. There are multiple rule sets and spatial differentiations if you don't use walls, but if you use semiotics, you can have multiple games at play at the same time. So this is the idea here, that you have different territories, and each time you go into different territory, a different way, in this case, of running or walking applies, and everybody who steps on knows that. And at the same time, these territories could also start to shift around. So I'm looking later on changing environments, but at each stage and step, they have a new set of instructions. And so I'm starting to look at social spaces which are not neutral and undifferentiated, but you can see here that the different zones have different speeds of movement and valency of gathering people, stop and communicate or push past each other, and that these inscriptions, these texts, help to get a certain self-organized communication interaction happening based on the idea of free agents. They're not on a schedule necessarily. So comparing this to the traffic system, in the city space you have a lot of actors roaming around. You have cars, buses, trams, bicycles, pedestrians, and they need this semiology of different types of line and signs to have a coordinated social process rather than kind of chaos. And more importantly, what I'm trying to develop is a visual language which isn't just single words. This is a retail, this is a shop, this is a residence and so on. But to build something more complex, because the big leap forward for human language was to move from a single term signaling language, where 10 words mean 10 messages, to a grammar-based language where the combinatoric of multiple terms generates a combinatorial explosion of expressiveness. And you see that in the traffic sign system. You have each sign is actually a complex sign built of multiple components, and in the combinatorics you can proliferate a lot of different messages. And that's the way we need to look at architectural spaces. We need to build something more systematic than the kind of haphazard signaling which also has broken down more or less in the contemporary visual chaos, and we need to build a grammar-based. So I'm starting to work on these projects where we build form coding, space codings, color coding, material coding, ornamental coding to distinguish different zones and subzones. And I just want one example, what I mean by visual communication and the absence of this in contemporary design. So if you look at an area like this, or here, you witness something which I would say is very disarticulate. And if you imagine in this kind of space, you would have a bus stop, a tram stop, and a car park. It doesn't configure a legible institution of a park and ride. So that's what we did here. So we have two car parks, we have across the road, and we continue this. We connect it up visually with the tram and with the bus, and we get something very legible and conspicuous, a spatiographical language articulating the ordinary park and ride, which would usually visually disappear in this visual chaos. And also would be and instead what we're generating something which is very elegant and conspicuous, and all the elements participate in creating that visual language. So the curve helps a lot to tie this together, because these car parks are separate. There's a road cutting this, but for the park and ride we emphasize the continuity. Across the road you can see the tram cutting in here, the bus cutting in here, you see the connection. And this graphic language, every element, whether it's the street markations, the lamp posts, they all are designed to communicate the flow of movement. They start low and getting larger and larger, so you can pull it along to the interchange, and then these posts become columns, these demarcation become lights. So we're bringing the different pragmatic elements, a light, a parking demarcation, a column, under one visual language that make them similar because they communicate one overall message. So you get legibility, you can see the tram coming in, the bus coming in, and when you look at the ceiling of the station and the floor, they start to look very similar, even though pragmatically, engineering-wise, they would do very different works, but architecturally, that means communication-wise, they work together. That's why they start to look similar. And that's the huge difference between architecture and engineering, that we are actually, our core competency is visual communication, and the technical engineering element is no longer our responsibility, that's the engineer's responsibility. And we have to work together to deliver something which is not collapsing, so the column is really a column, but from our perspective it's just another post guiding us through. So, and similarly, this building is all about, everything becomes a graphic communication element guiding you and directing you and distinguishing different types of spaces and so on. So that is a kind of universal condition of architecture which was always already at play, but it was at play unconsciously for most of history. But because our social institutions and life processes become recently so complex and dynamic, we can no longer leave the communication aspect to chance, and we actually have discommunication. We have visual chaos, I called it yesterday garbage spill urbanization. We have illegibility, and this gets in the way of the urban functioning. So this becomes disempowering. Because we're in a condition where we are not just daily walking the spaces we've always walked. We're not just going 9 to 5 and living in the same village for 50 years, where this is less important. Still important, but we are We even have to get into new environments, new situations with new people and new buildings and new cities and new districts, and even in a big city, you know, there are still hundreds and hundreds of districts in London I've not been to, and I should be able to find my way quickly under this condition and of increased complexity and mobility and dynamism. We need to care about the legibility and make the semi-logical project a conscious project, and the tools and materials of this articulation process, organization and articulation process, come through what I call parametricism. Again, the semi-logical project wasn't a conscious part of that, but it developed a new set of tools which make design more adaptive, more variegated, more complex and dynamic. And I just want to hint at this. Historically, this big shift in complexity and dynamism has to do with the fact that from the 20th century to the 21st century, we moved from what I call Fordism to post-Fordism. This was the era of modernism. Life was still relatively simple. Everybody 9 to 5, everybody cornflakes, a car, a washing machine, one TV channel, a one packaged holiday. And now we're generating much more diversity of elements, new things all the time, different places, different work environments, and also this technological setup now can absorb an enormous amount of innovation and variation, whereas this one couldn't. And the people who are locked in the assembly line are now set free to become creative, and they generate this very dynamic network society in central hubs, which needs a new kind of architecture. Not this kind of simplistic modernist architecture, 3 districts, business district, residential districts, manufacturing district. It needs a kind of complex mixed-use networking where multiple companies, including educational offerings, lifelong learning, generates research, development, marketing, financing to generate new products and to reprogram these robots or re-upload new services app which you could have updated and upgraded weekly, daily. So there's an enormous amount of absorption capacity for innovations. We all should become creatives and innovators because this technological structure and world of products can be innovated daily, weekly. And we don't have to be here anymore. So what are we doing? We are actually coming together as creative industry, and that creates a totally different city. And that's the kind of city we're working on. We're working on the creative industry, knowledge economy hubs, and we want to specialize on this. And there needs to be a lot of change and revolution in city development and city planning thinking. And that's what we're interested in, and we need entrepreneurial leadership to create these new districts. And instead of just organizing space through a handful of these platonic, simple figures, we have much more complex spaces to create. And to do that, we use dynamical systems, algorithms. Composition used to just be these, take that cylinder and arrange it next to the cube, and maybe a triangle, or make an axis, make a cross, never more than 3 or 5 things. But we have 100 things to coordinate, and in complex contingent contexts. So we want to have a lot of in-between conditions. We don't only have 5 stereotypes. And that's what we need to explore. We need to explore, so we can no longer work with a ruler and triangle. But AutoCAD is enough, where you just make the circle and rectangle in on the computer rather than with ruler and circle. We need to have a much more generative and explorative and organic design language. So these kind of linear systems, and the same with surfaces, so line, plane, volume. We have to be responsive, variegated, adaptive, to make a lot of different situations possible and slip between different situations. So this kind of idea of continuous surfaces, continuous flow, explorative configurations of gathering together. So these kind of, and towers which are opened up and become communicative. Not everything cut into cells or floors and cells and hidden behind elevators. You know, thousands of people in a building, but you don't know where they are, what they're doing. You should be coordinating with them, but you have no clue. On your phone, yes, but there's only one message at a time. You need to see everybody, ideally, and be aware, inter-aware and interconnected. Also on the volume side, you need not just to say this is one volume and there's a second volume. There may be fusing and partitioning and intersecting to various degrees. So you have much more variety of composing volumes and relative to each other. So there are degrees of integralness, degrees of connection and separation. And you need to have a space which is three-dimensional, open and porous, but still has places and subplaces, niches and intimacy zones, while at the same time being part of an overall field. So these are the kind of work in interaction spaces where you have specificity of location, but also simultaneity of awareness and visual connection. So this is the kind of space I believe is viable. So you have many things coming together. There's a lot of co-working zones on the ground floor with cafes, bars, restaurants, shops, and the various office spaces, small units, and there's a lot of interaction space and connection space, bridges, atriums, interior atriums, and this kind of utilization of all three dimensions so that you have things above, below, and all around, and not just something, one line in front of you to select. You need to have hundreds of destinations to select from. So we are thinking of these kind of environments of mega atriums where you have various zones and subzones and bridges and spaces, intervisibility, interconnection. And these are components of a city where these towers connect up and generate a kind of density. So in terms of urbanism, instead of having one grid, hundreds equal blocks, we should have variety because we have small, medium and large companies, small, medium and large residences, and we have existing structures we want to connect up to. So, but we shouldn't have this variation just chaotic, scattered like now, which becomes a visual garbage heap. But we should have this variation ordered so that you can be led from one to the other, and you can understand that the buildings become taller here, the atriums becoming bigger, and here becomes smaller grained, and it also connects up with the existing. This idea of swarms of buildings, but they're not randomly scattered, but they're ordered according to principles. And I would believe that a discipline which is of architects who understands that and contributes to this could achieve this, but also free market choices. If there was an underground station here, you would automatically find this kind of gradual falling off of site value and therefore of density, for instance, of occupation. So these are the kind of urban models we're looking at under the heading of parametricism. And I just want to briefly touch on, so the different stages of parametricism I've gone through. Foldism, where you have these continuous surfaces. Blobs is volumes intersecting and fusing and separating, and swarms of elements which gather and differentiate. And the tectonism is another level, has all of that at play, but has additionally leads to something which is very interesting on the expressive articulation side, but also on the engineering and technical side. So here, at this stage of pragmatism, we designed these forms and we asked the engineer later to fix up the structure. And that is used enormous amount of volumes for structure and was not. Now we're looking at trying to understand algorithmically designed, optimized structures and work from the beginning with engineers, but then we turn that into a semiological articulatory palette. So it is about engineering and fabrication logic as stylistic drivers and also as palette for visual articulation. So you can see here that this world looks much more rich and diverse. So it's not only soft surfaces, which are monochrome and slick, but there's very particular surfaces. There are ruled surfaces, there are curved folding, there are parabuloids, there are optimized shell structures, compression structures, tensile structures, minimal surfaces. There's a whole set of particular morphologies which have particular structural or environmental or fabrication constraints. And that becomes much more rich. It is much more demanding on the architect to understand these tools and techniques, but I think it's very rewarding if you achieve that. And this idea of using technical constraints and use them to make space and form and ornament and character has been always the case in traditional architecture. So the Gothic ribbed walls, they are actually these very particular forms. They're relatively structural optimal. They're not the absolute optimal. But you can see that different characterful spaces have been generated, and we're learning from this. The restriction here is that each church has one system and the base repeat. We want to do something more adaptive, more open-ended, and the church was also a stereotypical cross. We want to use this to make fluid, parametric, but tectonic systems. So this is the beauty of the exterior of the Gothic. Interior becomes on the exterior, and we vary the arch. We have compression and tension. We vary the profile, and we're getting something much more adaptive and continuous, but also something highly structurally light and optimal and characterful. So we're getting into some kind of parametric super Gothic, but it's just one example of what I call tectonism. So this was a student work at the AA. Some of these shell forms, we don't use spheres, we use actually catenaries or parabuloids, etc., which become more efficient, and then we generate architectures where we have certain choices of articulating the ribs as extruded ribs or as creases. So there's a lot of artistic variation still open, but we're always working with the structural optimal flow of forces, and we're generating something quite characterful and beautiful and telling and communicating, because the flow of ribs tells you where's the column. And if you put an opening, it also will redirect the flow. So there's this logic and rule-basedness is very communicative. And you get very characterful, communicative spaces. And then you can also vary the different types of spaces. They're not going to look all the same because they have different size, but also have different importance. So you use structural logics as semiological ornamentation. And we've done that, for instance, in a school building in China. And using some of these structural optimization tools to make these rib patterns characterful and beautiful, but actually optimal. So when we do the research, yes, we look at what we have learned from engineering, from the traditions of architecture, to bring that back, which was lost during modernism, where you just had extruded I-beams and plastering everything. And we are also doing material research at the university with models and finding different forms, morphologies. And what we could learn from Ferrauto, if you work with material, you get a sense of material optimization, and with elastic material you get real material computation. Because some of the engineering simulations does this, simulating material self-organization to find these forms. So in that way we discover morphologies and then translate them into algorithms. And this kind of form finding was started by Gaudi, in fact. With the hanging model, you find the optimal catenary and then turn it around. And also a network of catenaries, which would have been impossible to imagine and calculate on paper. He calculated model. Now we can simulate these structures in a much more complex one in the computer. But Gaudi is a great precursor. So these shell forms have been optimized in the computer with an elastic so-called mesh relaxation method, and then the ribbing pattern is another algorithms on top. And then we take that and we interpret this with different perforation densities and different extrusion thicknesses, and we generate a super light 3D printed chair, which has a lot of engineering optimization, and then also using new technologies of fabrication. So we did this also with a small pavilion, where we have first the shell optimization, then the rib optimization, and the third layer is a geometric fabrication optimization, because we can't 3D print this, but we found another way of set of algorithms so that we can do that out of simple straight elements in sheet material. So there are 3 layers of algorithmic optimization and generating something which is very beautiful and organic, but incredibly fast and cheap to make, because everything is robotically cut and assembled and fits perfectly. Similar, when we do concrete forms, we look at robotic hot wire cutting or 3D milling or 3D printing in concrete, and each technique has certain constraints. The angle, it shows up the lines, so all of these aspects become characterful for an articulatory project. So we like to show these lines, we like to, the world of 3D printing in concrete has a lot of variety, but it has a lot of unity. And then you can express a whole family of events. They're different and similar at the same time. And that's the way building a palette. So in all of these different techniques would come together and create a world of artifacts which are both different, varied in various types, and yet harmonize and connect up with each other. And it's something, a research work we're doing in the office with schools in London, and we're using our gallery to display. So it's part of a design research discourse. And some of these are actually startup companies which coming out of the student group, or in the milieu. There's a lot of robotic startup companies, fabrication startup companies coming out of this research, and then we stay in touch with and display this. So this is a startup company, this is a startup company, etc. And this is another one, ex-students who do 3D printing in plastic to generate some chairs. And fashion as well. But also larger structures. So if you look at modernism, and compare what we can do now with parametricism and engineering sophisticated tools. And parametricism is the only style which is actually congenial to the frontier of engineering. You can immediately see how crude this is compared to this. And that crudity is also incredibly wasteful because the amount of steel and concrete tonnage in such a structure is incredibly wasteful because you have to size up the critical member and then you repeat that and everything is oversized. So this is both lighter and eventually cheaper and stronger. So this is the way we evolve, and we want to have more efficient structures because we want to open up the space. We want to have the free flow of space. We want to be light-footed. The same later on with the environmental system and passive system. We don't want to waste space with huge concrete slabs and beams and huge ducts. There's no space left for human interaction. That's why these things matter. We want to have the open, porous, optimal structures. And this skeleton allows you to have an internal freedom, nearly of flying through the space, to perceive the tower as a vertical urban space, as a street you move up to. They have different bars, cafes, restaurant, the various balconies towards the rooms, and the connection, visual connection at the same time to the outside. So this video is just a kind of handheld camera at the opening when we did that. So I want the elevators to come out into the space and move freely through a space, and you can experience what's going on in the building, and then you can participate. You see something, I want to join, I want to come here. And so this kind of new degrees of freedom of spatial luxury, you need, of course, engineering intelligence. This is our Beijing airport. And there's an enormous amount of column-free space, so the freedom of populating this and roaming through. But it is also a navigation aid because you can, this is the main central orientation space. There's light coming in, and you can follow this light cut to your gate. So we've been developing these kind of structures and spaces, and I've done researches, the work I've done at Harvard with students, so we generate Google Campus, and we need to look at such. An airport is still a very simple social institution. Just parallelized, people pulse in, they have to find their gate, have a restaurant meal or a shop, and then they're off. They're not connecting. They don't have to find each other. They just have to find their gate. Here we're looking at Google Campus, 20,000 people maybe, or at least maybe 10,000 people of different disciplines, different departments with different projects. They have to collaborate, cooperate. They have to be inter-aware. They have to share knowledge and exchange ideas. And nothing can be centrally planned. They have 20% of the time free to find each other, to set up projects. So they need to be, how do you distribute 50 meeting zones? We don't know. We know one thing, we need to be open, porous, differentiated, flexible. But also, if you look at this, we're trying to make different types of spaces. And these shells articulate a zone better than boxes. And we also know where two shells kind of come together and yet apart. But you quickly realize, at the complexity and variety of a Google campus, one system becomes monotonous and insufficiently expressive. So we have this, each of these systems, we have a second one, these grid shells. You can see the attempt to make hierarchy and separation and fusion and connection and openness, so they're great. The third one based on catenaries. And there's a lot of variety, but at that scale it becomes monotonous. So I'm saying all of these systems have to be combined, so we need more richness, more diversity. and yet at the same time unity. So I'm looking at tectonism and have all the different types of spaces at play, the different colors, the different materials. You have similarity in one respect and distinction. You have similarity here and distinction, and again here. So you have a network of similitude and difference, and that you can, because in a Google department it is connects with one and is at the same time connects with another. So this space is both similar to this and to this, but in a different dimension. So it's part of two series, and that's the way we work. We have multiple network connections, and we need to articulate this. So that's the project. These tasks don't allow us to even to use the first wave of pragmatism is insufficient to deliver a empowering, articulate environment for an innovation hub like Google Campus. And we're looking back at inspirations, for instance, in tectonism. Dieste from the region is fantastic, but also Frei Otto. And we're looking back at historical models, but the parametric translation sets them free, so we don't restrict it to symmetry and repetition, but we could be asymmetrical, contingent, adaptive, and yet using, for instance, stone shells. People we collaborate with, super thin marble shells, irregular, but in total equilibrium. Tradition could make an equilibrium only if it was absolutely symmetrical. Here there is a hidden asymmetric equilibrium which allows these stones to fit together without mortar. And here you can see this model is our collaborator Philip Block from. So all these elements are just in an equilibrium, and a tensile loop captures all of them. They're held together, compression and tension, and when you take the scissors and clip this, the whole thing falls apart. So there's no mortar in these elements. Neither is here. If you take out some of these stones, the whole thing comes raining down. But that's the way traditional buildings were done. This was just the equilibrium of forces, like these staircases. So we're designing projects like this. But you need new tools to develop the elements, because each element is different to make that equilibrium puzzle. Also, tensile structures are beautiful, because the tensile form is not an arbitrary invented form. If you have an edge condition, there's one form which a soap film would find and a computer model can find, and we can tailor the fabric so it's an absolute optimal tensile equilibrium structure, and that gives a characteristic form. You can always sense it, you always know this is tensile. So you get a language of tensile structures. Again, an enormous amount of variety, but also an enormous amount of unity. Now imagine an architecture where there's a system of tensile forms, a system of compression stone forms, a system of metal pleated forms. They speak to each other, they resonate with each other, but they remain distinct and different. And you can scale that up using shell and tensile for Olympic Stadium. And so this is another material. It's subtly different. This is sheet material, so you can actually only do single curvature in terms of cones and cylinders, and you can play with this, you work with this. There's a lot of computational intelligence of simulating these processes, so you can start to simulate them in the computer, and then you can unfold them and build them. And that's what we've done in this shell structure. And we used robot to cut, score, and fold these elements. And we generate a super thin shell, 1 millimeter aluminum shell, out of these pieces for the Biennale. And again, we're looking back at pioneers like Candela. We use a fabric formwork to make a thin shell for a Mexico City exhibition. And we look at people like Nervi, who had an intuition about ribbing patterns optimized, but we can make them really optimal now with computational help. And then we combine Candela and Nervi and computational intelligence, and we're creating a grid shell which is super light, super efficient, and characterful and beautiful more than Candela's pure surface. And then I wanted to show that with these kind of repertoires, we now want to intervene in a place like Roatan, where we have our first project in the region. We want to use tectonism, highly organic, optimal, lightweight pavilions and structures and architectures to create this kind of innovator, incubation, entrepreneurial cluster, education and health industry and other industries in a kind of garden city, incubator, village, town, city. So these are the kind of first sort of shell spaces. We can make them larger. We can have what is beautiful in Honduras, you have a lot of wonderful weather. You can have a lot of outdoor spaces and open spaces to have gathering spaces, communication spaces. I went to university, here's all the corridors and staircases, outside classrooms. So to generate something which is in its first phase quite low-rise, but then we can also go multi-story and look at, balconies, verandas, outdoor spaces, and we generate a language which is adapted to the tropic environment, local sensibilities, and environmentally conceived. So we're starting to look at these kind of clusters, which are not resorts. They are entrepreneurial, incubator, creative industry hubs, and you also have a good time, of course, because there's a beach and it's like a university campus, a research development campus, incubator campus, perhaps in Roatan with a lot of outdoor space, a lot of green spaces, and so that's the vision. That's what we're here for. And I'll just show you that we've done this kind of incubator town or unicorn town in different other places, because in China they also have this change, which I think Latin America was going through, from a manufacturing region into a research development knowledge economy region. But China is very big on this, and they discovered they need special cities, places, districts, and they look at the campus typology. They're looking at the garden city, but not as sleeping city, the garden city as a campus and communication hub for network society and research. So this is in Chengdu, is precisely this kind of incubator city district in China. And we can build up quite a bit of density, and that's important because there's a lot of people who want to participate, but you make it green, you make it terraced, and you make it landscaped. And similarly, in another city in China, we're doing this waterfront garden city, which was a resort and now wants to become more. It wants to attract conferencing and creative industry companies, and combine student living and collective living, co-living, co-working in a garden city conditions. So these are experiences we have gathered and want to bring to Honduras and bring it to Roatan in particular first. So there's another one where we've done a scheme for a new high-tech city cluster. This is particularly geared towards robotics. So there will be a number of the robotics companies which China has now will be located here with respect to the research and development facilities with universities as well. So this is universities and research development companies and also some workshops. So we looked at developing deep floor plans, a lot of courtyard conditions, and in order not to come up high, we actually went down and have several levels of negative space around the courtyard, so that we don't, that we can harmonize with the landscape. And when it comes to residential, we went onto the slope in this kind of terraced tracing and terracing the contours, and then on top we have the larger spaces for offices. But I think the whole thing harmonizes quite well, and we have to think about transport. We're thinking about pedestrian transport, we think about lightweight electric vehicles, cable cars, trams, bicycle paths as well, maybe a monorail as well, and drones, of course. In these landscapes, particularly with the topography, a drone is becoming viable. I think you'll see that with respect to the clients we're working here in Roatan, that Roatan will be the first drone arena in the world. So this is some of these ideas we generated. And also we have example, we love to work in nature. So we have this little museum in the Alps, which we created, connecting up or student housing in Hong Kong. We don't want this anymore. We want to work and live like this with the landscape. It's also more communicative, a lot of courtyards, a lot of terraces, outdoor spaces, not these kind of batteries of disconnected cells. And this is another technology campus in Xi'an, China. Again, water, green areas, and this idea of openness, transparency, not very high, with a lot of green and visual connection. Drones, of course. But also we've done, just on a few things, we've done this for Cancun, and kind of green and garden city. We have created a proposal for Leon in Mexico, so the head of director of Mexico City office is here as well, working on some of these projects. And we also have done this for Cuba, a kind of village which aspires to a bit more density, but yet than the usual resort, where you have and you get more of a cultural exchange life in these kind of clusters, but still more resort than entrepreneurial incubator. But I just want to show as well that we already thinking about the region, that we have some works here, also urban works like the tower in Mexico City, and in Monterrey we have a project, etc., and a tower in Buenos Aires. But I wanted to show in particular what we're doing here in the region with respect to going into this kind of landscape-like embedded communities of excellence, communities of the knowledge economy. And again, we're doing projects like this in China, cultural projects, and this attempt, again, this is tectonism, shells and tensile structures, openness, open breeze flowing through. We don't want to have closed boxes and pumping a lot of energy through air conditioning. And another little idea of a very open villa embedded in the landscape in China. And again, we working with environmental parameters. So this is in Saudi Arabia. So we have very hot climate, and so we have courtyards. We're shielding them against the sun, and we're allowing wind to flow in. That's why we stagger the height and orient the cells. And then we generate these kind of fields of spaces, very important, of depths of communication, a lot of outdoor spaces. And again, tectonism means that not only structural parameter, fabrication, but also environmental parameter imprint themselves in the morphology and make them characterful. So regional climates will make a regional characterful architecture. And you can see that the same parameter of shielding against sun and opening to the wind affects both the solid areas and the canopy areas. So you have unity across these very different systems because they have the same parameters. And this is a very beautiful and organic architecture. It's complex, but with the new technologies we can bring this complexity under control. And with more and more contractors and fabricators gearing up with BIM and production methodologies, we can start to deliver these kind of very open and porous projects where you have a lot of interaction spaces, visual connection, a lot of outdoor spaces, and you have an environment of learning and communicating which is very different from a tower or from a building with lots of closed rooms. And so this idea of a semiology where you're reading your environment, I want to show, we can learn new languages. You all have learned the language, you've learned Spanish, I've learned English and German, they're very different. So we're not born with one or another, but also the blind, they can learn this language. So we have the capacity to learn new language, visual languages, tactile languages, and if the environment was designed like a text, we could read it. We could just walk through it and take in a lot of information, what's going on, what's where. Like moving across the surfaces on the ground, for instance. So the Braille language for the blind is actually imprinted in architecture, so there's a semiology. And why shouldn't we show much more and tell us much more just through the surfaces? But then again, through the ceiling, through the air, through the temperature, everything becomes message if it's articulated. And then we can walk through and take it in while we are on the phone, and visual information is also coming through. So it's a multimodal, all the senses are involved if we want to. So you imagine this kind of, because we have these kind of complex spaces to navigate. Again, we're doing a kind of Google headquarter building research with the students in Manhattan. Everything is open, everything is interconnected. There's visual porosity, but also you need to know what's going on beyond the field of vision. So these kind of complex buildings, they need to be semiologically empowered so that you feel at ease and that the thousands, hundreds of people and the various events on offer become clear. And the final stage in all this is that these kind of environments don't need to be static. They could have a lot of intelligence and variation. They could be responsive, they could also be spontaneous and creative in themselves. They could sense what's going on and then invite people to participate. They can see there's a potential for a gathering, so they support that gathering, or they separate groups which start to disturb each other. So the built environment becomes an AI-empowered social ordering frame, not passive. I love passive systems because they don't cost energy, but also active systems like this. So, and to know what we're doing with respect to this, we need to also understand what people would do, could do, will do in these spaces. So we need to also start to build an intelligent simulation capacity to understand what the various configurations we offer mean. So we need to simulate the life process. We need to, occupancy process needs to be simulated. And that's what we're doing. So as a research program I have, not with students, that will be too tough, with a PhD group, both in the office and at the University of Vienna, where we're starting to research interaction processes and we simulate them. So we can understand what happens if I put a second entrance. If I shift the furniture around in various ways, what would the likely outcome be in terms of encounter frequencies and encounters which lead to little communication settings. And to get a sense of this, we also do this on office. So we have a scenario in our office where there's a reception, there's coffee table, sofas, a big gathering table, different scenes and settings, and we simulate, trying to understand with the various types of people, the various departments, teams, consultants, visitors, clients, what kind of interaction would possibly occur, and to try different configurations to optimize for social functionality. So that's the research program, and we've started that long time ago just with illustrative capacity. Aids to imagine that a piece of furniture could be an active participant in creating or breaking up a social situation. So we have a lot of robotic furniture, if you like, intelligent furniture, partitions, chairs, benches, tables, who help us in our work and help management or help the host of an institution to get the best experiences for the event, to make things elegant, to mix things up so that you have a great experience, so you meet a lot of people, have a number of in-depth communications, you learn something, you don't miss anything, you can participate in larger groups, smaller groups, individually, etc. So you can imagine a world where we living together with a communicating architectural ecology of actors. And that's what we're researching at the AA as well. So we're looking also at the kinetic systems, the various materials and actors and engines and robots we can create, and how they might roam around, and it's quite playful at times. You can see it's just also getting a handle on simulating interaction, simulating material behavior, simulating human behavior. And some of this research is now 10 years old, and we're coming back to this and trying to make that more real now. And I'll show you in a minute how this works. So some of these ideas of transformability, I mean, of course, this is difficult, this is expensive, but sensors and actuators become more and more cheap. And if the pressure is on, if you can embed 3 or 4 scenarios in one space, rather than having to have 4 scenarios built next to each other, you know that there is efficiencies of space utilization which could potentially merit the investment in this technology. Of course, this is student work, so it's very playful and fanciful, but it's also important. You have a kind of innovation, but I think some of this, the time is ripe. We had now the art space experimenting with interactive installations for about 20 years. We have sensors, actuators, and I think it's time to generate something which to make that instrumental and effective for life. So this, particularly if the pressure on space keeps coming at us, where we want to be in close proximity with each other, we want to everything walkable. The density of people per square mile can be increased tenfold, I believe, and all the spaces then required. Cars need to be out of the city for interaction, and we need a lot of transformability so that this condition where all the apartments are empty for 10 hours, unutilized, it becomes a problem. So we have this kind of idea of robotic furniture, of robotic and self-transforming architecture, of active social ordering, not only through fixed configurations but through adaptive configurations. And that is still a research project, mostly with this is all work from the AA students over the years. And it's getting more sophisticated, so because these agents understand the situation and act accordingly. It's like we learn a lot technology transfer from the gaming industry, where the games are filled with autonomous counterparties and actors who are given rules and capacities and stratagems and that's the way we start to simulate. So we don't have to recreate a lot. We have to script particular behaviors and protocols which we learn from social interactions, as we all know from our own interactions in such spaces. But we can use the game engines like Unity and Unreal to develop this, and therefore we can deliver to architecture totally new capacity, namely semiology, responsiveness, and knowing what we're doing through live process simulation. So we particularly if we do different spaces, unusual configurations, we require, of course, some kind of tools of simulation and imagination, what these different and unusual forms might do, how they might be used, how they might facilitate interaction processes, and that also to some extent needs to be quantified eventually. We're knowing this is the kind of world we want to live in, but we don't know how much of the various types and subtypes would be economically efficient or effective with respect to. So what I'm saying here in terms of architectural models, an architectural model must be a model where we're showing the interaction process. We need to show the personas, the social diagram. We need to fill these spaces with the activities that meant to be taking place. That's our duty. Social functionality, social ordering. That's why I'm saying we need to show these kind of spaces, simultaneity of interaction, simultaneity of presence, complexity of interaction. But we need to also take responsibility to start to know what we're doing, and that's why we need to set up these simulation. I believe that, and that's a research project. It's not a capacity the discipline has, but I think these are the capacities we need in order to, and I let this run here, in order to deliver these very, very important sites of high performance creative work, which is the prosperity engine for the 21st century. And you can imagine that the productivity of a firm like Google, which you use daily 100 times, not only the browser, but Google Maps, Google Earth, Google X, Y, Z, and the continuous updating of that, and that's for billions of people, for free, is the kind of prosperity engines which need us and our space. And if you look at the latest Google campus designs, they actually are influenced by these researchers and these designs, with colleagues from London or New York like Bjarke Ingels and Thomas Heatherwick. So that's the world we are interested in developing, and that's also glimpses of this, segments of this, and pioneering satellite clusters of this is what we want to do here in Roatan. And with that, I want to open the debate. Thank you for your attention. Okay, great. Thank you. So, well, the legacy of Zara is actually, she was a great revolutionary. She has opened up the freedom of design immensely. Because before her, we used very rigid geometries. circles, rectilinears. Maybe there was a curve, but usually it was just a circle or arc. She was inspired by Niemeyer, who was maybe one of the most open and fluid, but he still just used straight lines and arcs. And she did the full versatility and virtuosity of the hand sketch in space. One of the things. So she incredibly expanded our versatility of design. The other legacy element is she always said, you know, experimentation must never stop. So that she is part of a generation who said there is something like an architectural avant-garde. There's a kind of research project, not the quick move to the front, doing better what others are already doing, but the long path, 20 years of risky investment, not knowing if this leads to where it should lead. And I think these two are very important things. Some people need to take these risks, some people need to make this investment and invest in the new and the unknown. And these are entrepreneurs, whether they're, and Zaha was one of them. And we were joining her, and we are therefore, we are doing well now, but it took very late in life in a way that we did well, and it was risky. So that's the legacy. The next, but also he's asked, how do we know? If it's very complex, it's very difficult now, we need these kind of simulations to know more. Smaller arrangements you can imagine and think through. Larger and complex conditions, you can no longer close your eyes and imagine things, you need simulation. Both.
As a student, which programs do you use to approach the system in concept?
Okay, so we're investing also a lot of BIM. We have a BIM group, and we're using, of course, Revit, and we're using CATIA. But I think what is more important than that, and I know that you have starting to use BIM here at the school, that is once you have already the design, and if it's complex, you can realize it, and you can adapt it when you have change management, etc. It's very important. But to generate the design in the first place, you can't use Revit easily. So that's where I invite you to use. I mean, we use a number of tools. We're using Maya for the initial intuitive sketching. Then we use a lot of Rhino and Grasshopper. You need to start scripting for the rationalization and variation and intricate articulation. We need that. So you need to start. I mean, my recommendation is that we're also doing a lot of specialized coding on the innovative front. But for you here, I highly recommend that you invest in Grasshopper capacity in the school. And you can share that. There's a lot of online tutorials, and there's a lot of plugins you can share. It's a beautiful community, and you learn a lot. You learn a lot on the online forums, and that's the way you become the versatile parametric designer, and you invest a little bit, and that's where you can also start to build scripts and definitions in a slightly more intuitive way than just writing lines of codes, which is very difficult to get into. So that's what I highly recommend. Okay.
Our question is, what would be the biggest challenge for you in better design to propose something in a country that is foreign, in which the context is totally different from what you guys are using and proposing by design?
Actually, we only work in foreign countries. We have very little work in our home country, and all our staff are foreigners. So we have 450 people, and from 55 different countries. So I don't think anything is foreign to us on the planet. And there is many different societies and different stages of development, but we know where civilization as a whole moves towards. And you find very similar challenges all around the world. And so we can adapt to particular local conditions, but the aim is very similar because we're all living in one world, we're competing and want to participate in the world culture, world architecture, and world creative industry networks. And I think that can be done from everywhere in the world, also from here, from Honduras, and that's what we're trying to do here. Of course, there's local climates, there's regional constraints, there's also interesting regional techniques and crafts we can integrate, but we work all over the place and all the world, and I'm not worried about fitting in and making sense, because, as I said, there's a global culture all these places want to converge towards, and that's what we're bringing.
The next question, what are the architectural tendencies of the mid-century world?
Okay. I believe that each era has to find a set of principles and insights and then build the respective intelligence and skills to deliver towards us, because there's particular challenges and tasks and particular technological tool sets which can be brought to bear. So that means there is one best practice, and that we need to converge towards and find together in a research and discursive process. And at the moment, architecture is immature and fragmented. And I think because the new conditions of the civilization, which are called post-Fordism and network society, are relatively new, and we need to, not everybody, and there's unequal and uneven development, but I think the parametricism and tectonism is the direction of the 21st century for the coming decades, just like modernism was the direction and sort of valid principle for the industrial city of the 20th century. So that's what I believe. There is one, as I said, world architecture, one frontier, and one set of principles and insight and skills which we collectively have forged. Is not something I invented. It's a whole generation of architects developing together, but it is an avant-garde. And then there's a lot of retro styles. So there's people who still want to do minimalism, who want to do postmodernism, neo-historicism. So there's a fragmentation, but none of the other offers has anything forward-looking and innovative. They're just retro. So that need to reflect on. Then you realize that there's only one progressive, forward-looking movement. That is, you can see it also. It's the only movement that can absorb the most sophisticated engineering intelligence, like engineering optimization, leads you straight away from minimalism. So minimalism, for instance, is incompatible with the structural optimization. Just one clue. But it is also incompatible with social process, crowd modeling optimization. Because a crowd doesn't want to have all these straights and corners and rhythms. It has something much more organic. So that's why I think there's one collective project which I invite all of you to participate in. And we need to give up the idea that there's a kind of meaningful individual choice that, but I like minimalism. It's something which holds you back and will hold your clients back. Of course, not if it's a holiday house where you are where it's a kind of trivial task nearly, even though there could be more elegance, the way you can embed in a landscape. But if you want to do a kind of real high performance project of importance, like a university campus, but you have a kind of aesthetic sensibility of yesteryear, you will stunt this institution. So you will do harm to your client. And it's totally collaborative. I think it's totally collaborative, meaning that it's not going to be single hand. It's not like, look, it's great, Brasilia is beautiful, and it makes sense for a very simple society. everybody has a residential place on this wing, and then there's a kind of government axis, and at the intersection there's a retail. And then you can have one person, Lucio Costa, drawing it, one architect, Niemeyer, executing it. It's a very simple life. The contemporary city cannot be created like this. That must be a collaborative, cumulative process of emergence with many individual intelligence acts. That's very important. If the individual act is stupid and misinformed, then the aggregate will be chaotic. But the best we can do collectively is lots of intelligences grafting upon each other without, there's no chance of one central intelligence directing it all. So we have to give up on central plans, and we have to have an emergence and trust in the individual intelligences which share sort of principles and values. So we also reflect back on what we're achieving and we're criticizing it. So I'm saying markets and discourses. But both markets and discourses don't have rulers. They are both bottom-up processes, but they are different. The market process is one where you really try and fail, but you don't know why. There are too many factors. So you need discourse to then guide and critique. And also you can critique ahead of failure. So markets and discourses is what we need. And there are collective processes, and the complexity barrier precludes that we have any overloading and point of authority in the system. I think the lecture speaks to that, but look, philosophy is okay. Well, I think it's important that that I can use some of the phrases which have been used. So yes, it has to be human-centered, but I think more important, it has to be society-centered. Human-centered is the individual has to feel well-being in a space, sure, but that doesn't deliver a social process of hyper-productivity. So society-centered and sociologically informed, and then you need to allow for a creative process with a lot of exploration and filtering through simulation. That's what I've been showing. So it's in a sense important that we look at new methodologies and new values, and we're much more conscious about the purposes. We cannot rely on routines and rule books. The old school is over. Finito. Well, I think, yeah, the mistake is often that we work with preconceived models, whereas we cannot afford to do that. We should work instead with a set of principles through which we can discover a solution. We shouldn't come with a solution. And I think that mistake is made too often. Even we have to remind ourselves, because there's pressure of time, and then you just do something, you pull something out of a drawer. Don't do that. It's a great place. I'm happy to be here. And same I was saying with Zaha, I just adored her work and I had to meet her. And I was then saying, I'm going to work for you, whether you pay me or not. I think that's all we have time for. Thank you. Eric, you want to say something?
En este momento, este evento no sería posible sin la colaboración y el apoyo de New Way Capital, que es la firma que ha gestionado para que venga a Honduras y ser el primer proyecto de la región centroamericana en nuestra bella patria Honduras. Eric Grimmel es el gerente general, CEO y colaborador y tiene el gusto de presentar una gran sorpresa. This event was made possible in part by New Way Capital. New Capital is the firm that has commissioned SAP to come to Honduras and do their first project of the region here in our beautiful Honduras. Eric Grimmel is the third managing partner and he has something exciting to announce. Mr. Brickman, please join us on the stage.